Okay, we're starting the podcast here at Tom Shillue live from the basement. I've got my fake bookcase behind me and very excited to start podcasting again after a really, okay, it was a break. Let's just face it. But, I don't like to spend a lot of time apologizing for my lack of podcasting during my podcasts. It's a lot of negative thinking.
Hello?
But why don't we bring my guest right out? I have him in the waiting room here. When I said I've got to relaunch this podcast, I couldn't think of a better guest to get for this first episode. So why don't we invite him into the studio right now? And we have him here, Mark Changizi. Mark, welcome.
Glad to be here. I don't know if you remember, but I think you were the first COVID interview that I did back in, might have been April, or it was the earliest. It was, I've since done many dozens, but I think you were the first. Yeah. 3 years ago, three plus.
I was wondering that. That was one of my first things I was going to ask you was, you're on my COVID list. You have been for years, and I still have my COVID list, even though, everyone is saying, this whole thing is over. It's not over for guys like you and me, because we want to keep the idea alive that what happened was very, very bad and it can't happen again. So I don't want to ever stop talking about these past few years.
Right.
But I was going to ask you, how early on did people start kind of flocking to you? Because that's where I discovered you. After COVID hysteria started, I immediately went on the search for people who were not buying into the hype. And you were one of the first guys I found. I mean, you were broadcasting, I believe, in the January, February, March, in March of 2020, you were
early March. Yeah. March 10th was my first tweet trying to calm people the F down. And I was traveling actually in Turkey and before that. So I kind of just got back, and my wife was going to go to Iran, and they canceled her. We canceled the trip because Iran was going nuts, and so that first time I had a time to even talk about it was March 10th, and so ever since then, I kind of exploded because I was one of the few voices early on, and one of the earliest voices, and one of the few, because back in March it wasn't but a trickle of us, even 2 months, it hadn't polarized yet. A lot of the folks, I couldn't find anybody that was like me. I remember my first colleagues on this were some communists, capital C communists, and they're not leftists by sort of regular old Western standards. They're real communists, and real capital C communists are always worried about locking down and pausing economies because they're barely able to run it themselves, and they've got a chip on their shoulder about how to keep centralized economies alive. So they were really, there's like, you can't do that. You can't suddenly stop these things. So it took a long time before, but maybe by a long time, I mean 30 to 60 days before it slowly shifted and became more left supporting lockdowns and more right sort of against it. But in the beginning, it wasn't like that at all in March and April. And then it polarized a little bit more by May, and then a year later, it's entirely a supposedly conservative left, and versus the left kind of issue. But initially, it wasn't.
In fact, being that early, I don't think your first tweets were about authoritarianism or control or anything like that, because there was no authoritarianism or control. There was just panic in the initial thing. It wasn't, oh, the government is going to shut everything down or whatever. In the first stages, everyone was just, kind of locking their doors and not letting the delivery man into their home. They were canceling parties and things like that. But there wasn't any sense of that our freedom was about to be taken away. It was more just general panic. And I think you were already on board at that point. Am I right?
Yeah, but from my point of view, it always had the seeds and all of the signs of totalitarianism on its rise. And I remember even March 15th, my CrossFit buddies, we were being discouraged from being inside gyms. They were beginnings of the lockdowns. The big panic, I think, kind of exploded March 11th. And then they started to talk about lockdowns by, I can't remember, March 15th, 16th. So we were just working out in the field of some middle school, and some lady pulled over, middle-aged lady, and ran out into the field and says, "Who are you guys? You're not allowed to be working near one another outside, distancing from one another. You're not allowed to do this." And she kept saying, "Which gym are you from? I'm going to call the city on you because you're putting the entire city at risk by you." So there's this very agitated person who in normal life would look like a very meek person, but having the confidence to go brazenly verbally attack a whole bunch of sort of, CrossFitters with weights and stuff they're throwing around, right?
And you're outside.
We're outside.
Yeah.
But so you start to see totalitarianism is built on the backs of meek people with sudden righteous justification to control others times millions, right? Any one of those you can laugh off. But when I say like, no, this lady's not normal. She's willing to go to the ends of the earth to tell us to stop doing it because she believes she's righteously justified to do so. And that's the seeds of disaster on its way.
I think one of the early tweets that you sent out was about contagion. It was like, something about the moral of the story will be, it was one of these predictive tweets.
Right. The moral of coronavirus will not be that about the dangers of biological contagion, but about the dangers of social contagion. Referring to moral panics, mass hysteria, that's really what the moral will be. That had been pinned for almost 3 years, and now it's part of sort of a pinned thread, but it's not pinned any longer. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what we're seeing now is, oddly enough, when I booked this, I was talking to Andrea. I said, let's get Mark on this podcast. She contacted you and she said, oh, this would be great with people talking about masks coming back and things like that. And I thought to myself, is she right? I don't think people are talking about masks coming back. But then over the past 3 or 4 days, I'm starting to see the old style newscasts that look like let me just play a little bit of this. I think I can do this. I can share my screen. And it's just 3 stooges on CBS talking to a doctor as if we've learned nothing. We'll just watch a little bit of it. I don't know how much I can take with this, but let's share this the screen here, and we'll take a look.
Good morning to you, Celine. I'm getting on a plane again. I'm thinking, where's my mask? Do we need to go back to that?
Well, I am myself hopping up on a plane tomorrow on vacation for a few days.
Yay.
I will be wearing a mask.
Can we hear that, Mark?
Who wants to get
Yes.
sick while you're on
Okay.
vacation?
Yeah.
You know?
Nobody.
So I think if you are going to be in a crowded public place, the subway, an airplane, a crowded theater, those are the kinds of places I would at least consider wearing a mask.
Mm-hmm.
We should clarify with that, with the schools in Kentucky, they're closing down not out of an excess of caution, that phrase we used to always use, but because they don't have teachers and staff, right?
They don't have enough teachers and staff to take care of the students at school. So people have a right to call out sick if they're not feeling well. And
Yeah.
I think, to prevent people from calling out sick, some of the things employers might want to do is have on-site vaccinations available to
Okay,
people.
I
not
can't-
force people to
I
get
can't even
vaccinated,
take
but at
it.
least
I
make
mean,
it
it's
as
like-
convenient.
It's like mentally deranged people talking to other deranged people. But did you see this coming, the return this season of this kind of talk?
Well, I think there's 2 points to be made. One is these kinds of social narratives that occur, once they're built and once within their community, and I mean the lockdowner community, once they're built, they almost never go away. And there's sort of a long conversation about this, but they work by virtue of, they're decentralized, these narratives. They're a lot like blockchain. Bitcoin works because it's sort of the records of who did what are on, hundreds of thousands of computers distributed about, oh, Mark sent Tom Bitcoin, and so now I can't spend that amount of Bitcoin on somebody else. These things are spread throughout the community, and there's all these sorts of reasons for why narratives are unalterable. They're difficult to alter, and there's sort of mathematical reasons that with the way that social networks work, it makes it unalterable, and that's good, so that you can keep track of gossip and social reputation over time, so that I can't lose reputation, to you on the basis of me being a douchebag, and then later, like, I just say it never happened, right? It's very hard. So that's how these things, once they're built, these narratives, these sort of gossip over time that get added to the social narrative, it's very hard to break. So that community still believes all that. But what's different this time is that I think instead of it being a small minority, like 1% in March and April and May of 2020, because it became polarized, a lot of people came to my side just for political reasons. They go, well, my team seems to be conglomerating on the anti-lockdown side, so I'm going to go there. Yeah. I'll take that. I mean, I wish it wasn't, that's sort of a human irrationality. We often sort of end up polarizing into two teams, but sometimes I think that can be good for society because it provides almost an automatic counterbalance to the crazy side at any given time. So this time we have, it feels to me that we have 50-ish percent of the population. I don't know exactly how, but we don't have 1 or 2%. We have a very vocal, evidence-filled, civil liberties, brazen group of folks who will not do this again. We will cause massive trouble if they try.
And you can see it kind of. I just got on the subway the other day. What was I doing? Oh, I was getting on Amtrak. So I took the subway to Amtrak, and then I took Amtrak. There's people on Amtrak in the Northeast Corridor wearing masks. It's not 25, 50%, but it's 10%, 5 to 10%. On the subway in New York, I would guess that it's more than 10%. 15% of people wearing masks. You said something, and I think it was might have been today, but you might have been retweeting a different discussion that you had. But I want you to talk about the comparison with the head covering. You talked about Iran, your wife, and I think yourself. You have Iranian background, is that right?
Yeah, my dad is from Iran. Yeah.
Okay, so you were talking about the head scarf in terms of the discussion. And in terms of data, because even with COVID people, and I would say people that are on my good guy list on Twitter and things like that, when I see some of the doctors who were skeptical of COVID at the very beginning, and they were kind of coming out with realistic data and things like that, they're still very data-based people. And they always want to talk about the data. They want to talk about the masks, which you have done. You do talk about reasons why masks are bad, reasons why they might cause falls, lots of different things that other people weren't discussing. But I kind of thought it was interesting the way that you framed the discussion, because I'm fond of saying I don't care about data. And it's not really true in that I like to look at it when it exists, but I don't follow data. I follow a different set of rules. And so you were saying that if you went to Iran, well, why don't you explain it to me? You know what the video I'm talking about.
Right. So, if you phrase it in terms of some other circumstances like headscarves in Iran. So the question is, the reason that, the social milieu in Iran thinks that women should wear headscarves, there's actually justifications for it. There are societal functioning justifications, and is that society runs better, works better when women are covering up their femininity, their sexuality, and otherwise you have men whose heads are being. I'm not saying there's a good argument. I'm just saying they argue these things, and they are carefully structured arguments within the Islamic literature that, and of course, there's a kernel of truth to these things. I mean, the sexual deviancy, you can and we've gone through that kind of thing in the United States as well. So they have arguments that for the function of society, it's better for women to be covered, their hair being covered. And the question that you could start asking, well, actually, now that I understand that it's an empirical claim of some kind rather than just a religious edict, we can just go test. We can say, well, let's just do some tests. Let's take a bunch of villages where we mandate it and a bunch of villages where we don't. And then we have a 30-year comparison in terms of societal dysfunction and number of, divorces or whatever, and You could do a lot of kinds of measurements of this kind. And I'm hoping that sounds absurd to you, right? It ought to sound absurd because that's not what you should do. Women should be allowed to not wear headscarves if they don't want to, right? It's not about doing the careful RCTs about whether when women do or don't wear it, you have a better society in terms of these sorts of large-scale issues in society. That is missing the point. And if we spend all of our time, and of course I have spent a lot of time arguing about cardiovascular issues and falls and a whole movie. I've done a movie, Face Masks, the movie now, which is just on the psychosocietal sides and nobody else talking, which are kind of more general kind of harm. But if you focus just on these kinds of harms, well, maybe next week or next year they come up with a mask that has no cardiovascular harms. And it actually does stop the virus rather than failing to. And it's, really comfortable. It has all the things you ever would, most of the things that you want to complain about, it actually does it. And now where are you? Now you're having to say, well, now the cost benefit is such that it's maybe better for flu every year, 6 months of the year, to wear this all the time, everywhere you go. And they've done all the math and all the careful science, and this new technology just works. No, you've implicitly assented to saying, yes, were such technology available. And I don't think any of us, in fact, would say yes. We say, no, human faces are important. They're expressive. They're my identity. And again, there's a whole movie-length argument along that basis. So, at the end of the day, whether it's important or not, it's under your own lights as to whether you should be allowed to do it or not. And that's at the end of the day what we all, I hope, believe. And so we shouldn't require data to get to that point.
Yeah. So if you had someone talking about headscarves and they started going through data saying that, showing you whatever data you wanted to use, these are the countries where headscarves are used, the way they did with masks. These are the headscarf wearing countries. Yeah. And look at the economic output of them, or look at the happiness quotient, or whatever these things do. You'd kind of laugh at them because you just say, well, right. It doesn't matter. I'm not wearing it. Right. But somehow when someone said, this new study says masks work, I had to sit down on panels with people on Fox News, and they were saying, well, this new thing says that masks may be of assistance, especially when you have older relatives. And I would say, I don't care. I'm not covering my face. And they would look at me like I was a lunatic. But that argument works for almost everything except these medical issues. So did you and I fall into a trap talking about data? I almost feel like we played into a game when we were saying, like, look at the particles that come off of masks. It's like with global warming. If you get into an argument about whether or not this policy works or not, you've already lost, because the idea is you've already decided that it's our job to control. I don't even know where you stand on climate change, because I only know limited things about your views. But I think no matter what it is, what kind of public policy, whether it's climate change or whether it's headscarves, I feel like if it's not about the data, you shouldn't argue data. And I think the reason you gave was the best. They're going to come out with something that they'll either prove it through some paper that may or may not be correct, or someone's going to invent something that does block a virus. And then they're going to say, well, you guys said it was all about how it was ineffective, but it's not. I don't care if it's effective. Covering faces, I think, is very, very important. It's very important to not cover the human face. And that overrides almost any, pandemic, even if it's a bug we haven't even heard of before.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the other example I talked about, you mentioned in Khmer Rouge is going into cities in Cambodia and forcibly marching everybody out into the countryside to become peasant farmers instead. And then you might go to Pol Pot. You say, Pol Pot, I've done all the studies, and if you do forcibly march whole entire city populations out and force them to be peasants, here are the positive sides and here's the negative sides. And if you actually do the math, it turns out the negative sides after these 10 years are much. That would be ridiculous. Like, no, Pol Pot, you don't have the right to forcibly move people, an entire city filled with people, out into the peasant countryside. So yeah, now, of course, I have done both. Now, part of the reasons, in some sense, we're struggling to do anything. When we see this kind of collective hysteria, I don't know whether I'm ever going to switch anybody's mind who's already in it. But there's tons and tons of silent people who haven't made a decision at the early stages, right? They haven't figured out what's right to do. So if you can show them, like, look, it doesn't even make, lockdowns don't even work in their own life. Even if I thought it was okay to be utilitarian and do whatever measures and, violate civil liberties for the good, They don't even make sense on their own face. Masks don't even make sense. They don't even work narrowly. So this is the simplest cost benefit analysis you ever need to do, because there's just no upside. It's all downside. So that shows that the people on the lockdown side are in some kind of weird moral panic. They can't even argue and consider things rationally. So this is evidence that you should not be on their side. You know, it's almost like convincing people on the fence, like, that side's crazy, and here's why, and here's the empirical evidence that shows. So that's part of why I think it might have been important, nevertheless, to make the empirical arguments.
I had a lot of conversations with people, especially at Fox News. You had a lot of people who were, I guess they were conservative. They were suspicious of the government overreaction, but they had different levels of revulsion over the rules. And most of them seemed to think that the worst part of the pandemic was the vaccinations, that the idea of forced vaccinations or coerced vaccinations and that kind of thing. What do you think? Because I have found, to me, separating the social distancing and contact tracing, I guess let's just forget contact tracing for now. Social distancing and masks, to me, was the worst of it. You know, I'm very against forced vaccinations. I don't think any vaccinations at all should be required. They basically require them of kids. You can get out of it, but you have to kind of be almost like separate from society. So I'm very against coerced medical treatments of any kind. But for me, I saw a lot of people who were like, well, the shutdowns and the masks are okay because that's just epidemiology at work. But the forced vaccination is where I draw the line. To me, masks, number one, covering human faces, to me, is the most inhuman thing that the government's ever required of people. It's one of the worst things that's ever happened in the country. And sometimes when I say that to people, they're like, "What, are you kidding me?" I'm like, "No, I'm not kidding you."
Yeah, you remind them by showing them that picture from 2005 or whatever it was of the Guantanamo prisoners entering, right, from the Middle East. They're entering the Guantanamo prison, and they were all on the ground and shackled, and they all have face masks. And there was a huge brouhaha at the time about how this was torture, and it was a big embarrassment for the Bush administration, if I recall. Right? I mean, this the general thought is like, look, putting masks on even prisoners was torture, right? And now, 15 years later, it's okay to require it of everyone, everywhere, all the time, right? It was just bizarre. Right? Now, I don't know how to answer the question about which, we tend to say forced vaccination, but of course it was forced masking, and it was also forced social distancing and forced lockdowns. They were all forced, right? They were all coerced. So I think that they're all, I don't know how to really compare. At the end of the day, forced medication, injections seem somehow even worse, I suppose, but they're all way over the line. If I had to say one of the things that was even worse, even more than those, was the censorship, the state censorship. And I'm one of the lawsuits. I don't know if you. So it's Changizi versus the Department of Health and Human Services. The First Amendment lawsuit was mine. The Missouri District Attorney's was 3 or 4 months after ours. They had more leaks and more information that had come out between the relationship between Twitter and Facebook and the federal government by then. So we were dismissed. We were under appeal. They're going to come back with a judgment whether we can continue, probably within a month. So here's the sense. Here's the sense in which I think that's qualitatively even worse than anything else that they have done. If you're a utilitarian, and I'm not a utilitarian, but at least if you're a utilitarian, you might be able to justify why you can have mandates for masks and lockdowns and even vaccination mandates and so forth, right? Because it just makes for a better world. I don't think, in fact, even by their own lights that it holds up. But when you start censoring, so the way that I'd like to analogize is that imagine you're a scientist and I'm a scientist and there's a bunch of other scientists and they're all in their labs and we all study something, I don't know, bird feathers or some bullcrap, right? It doesn't really matter. And it turns out that, this is part of the free expression or free market of ideas in science, that I've been arguing these things. And maybe after many years, it turns out that, Tom, you're right and I'm wrong. And then I sort of lose some reputation because I was pushing the wrong thing all these years. But what if it turned out that instead I was going around burning all the labs of my competition, ensuring that there were no other voices against my view about bird feathers, right? I was literally just preventing any competition to happen by burning or by ensuring they don't get funded. I was behind the scenes violating the scientific community sort of etiquette of, no, you let 1,000 flowers bloom, they argue against you, you argue against them. That's how it should work. When the state entered the game and prevented skeptical voices from being heard, forced them to be canceled, censored, shut down, and if you're suspended from one, you should be suspended from all of them, says Jen Psaki in 2021 and April of 2021. It's completely crazy that if Twitter suspends someone, that Facebook doesn't also. We're working with social media to ensure that that happens. That is how you should think about it. Somebody like that is no longer utilitarian in the sense they are just trying to enforce one position at the expense of everything else. And I think this is going even beyond what any utilitarian could justify, which makes it worse on all counts.
I don't know what your personal views are on. I mean, you strike me as kind of a libertarian type of guy. Would you describe yourself as a libertarian, or
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so libertarian.
Little L, yeah.
Right. Yeah, you're not hanging out at Reason magazine with the guys or whatever. But and I don't know your religious background, but I want to ask you about. I would venture to guess maybe just in when I watch your videos that there may be a kind of a either an agnostic or an atheist kind of streak or something like that.
I'm atheist. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm Catholic. All right, and I am among a group of, I would say, conservative Catholics or traditional Catholics that didn't buy into nobody I knew in my community bought into the pandemic panic. And I think that I noticed that across different religions, that the conservatives / fundamentalist type of religious people weren't buying into it. But a lot of the major religions did. I mean, the Catholic Church itself they really wimped out. They closed their churches, but the conservative end, like the Latin Mass Catholics, they kept their churches open and things like that. So you, as a guy who is non-religious, did you find that it was interesting that, did you find brothers in the religious world that they were surprisingly simpatico with you? Did you notice that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly did. And I've hypothesized without evidence, and I've done science moment videos in my YouTube series, that could it be that when you are actually deeply religious and you already have a righteous cause always there in your head every day that fills your mind and fills your sort of the way you think about the world, that's in some sense inoculates you from getting absorbed in these kinds of mass hysterias that sweep through with this new righteous cause, in this case, zero COVID. Now, I think it's possible. It's certainly on the basis of just sampling the world. We saw, massive amounts of religious people all around the world fall into it. A careful study like this would be to see how religious really were they. Like, did it, are they religious in name only, and just, or does it, you have to come up with some quantitative measures to see whether it hold up. So I don't know if that's true. It seems semi-plausible as a hypothesis to put forward. But I'm not sure if there was any real correlation. It just seemed to me just as many within the community sort of held up and withstood the hysteria as fell within it. I'm not sure that I see it. To the extent that there could be an association, you're worried that it has nothing per se to do with, it has more to do with that they were more on the right in the first place. And so, the real question is, what were they doing in March? A lot of people were freaking out in March. They were part of the, they were really, and then they switched over once it started to polarize into two camps again. Well, the right tends to have more religious people, and so more people from the right who were freaking out, so realized, all the people on my side are over there, and they cluster over there. It wasn't per se due to being religion. It has to do with some existing associations between left and right in a religious fold.
Have you noticed that people, when I was in college, the left-wingers were very suspicious of government, okay? Yeah. They were anti-war. They didn't like the government. They were anti-authoritarian. It's definitely flipped. And do you think it is pandemic-based? Do you think during these few years of the pandemic, people just switched? All of a sudden, you have these people who trust big pharma, big government, these kind of world bodies. People on the right now are very suspicious of these world bodies in a stronger way than they ever were. But people on the left now, I can't believe how they're marching in step. What happened to the old hippies who were suspicious of authority?
Yeah. I think one could certainly argue that there were signs of it potentially before 2020, but I think something qualitatively big happened when 2020 happened. Some of it due to the fact that Trump was president at the time, and he was a little bit looking like he was like, calm the F down. And so then that means the other side has to say, no, it's the most dangerous thing ever. And so you end up with these kinds of, and so, there's some, micro physics, in some sense, political physics that probably happened there that might have then pushed the left to become much more authoritarian because of that. And so, I did an early video, one of the early videos that had tremendous number of views, was just how the typical left-right, it's called the Dolan or Nolan diagram, the typical triangle that shows libertarian, authoritarian, and then left and right, or left and right, I can't tell on the screen. Usually, so the left and right of actual people is sort of a little in the middle, the actual range, but it really flipped over. So most of the people on the right are now very much, in terms of personal freedoms, they're very much, in terms of all the COVID stuff, they're very much on the libertarian side. And economically, they were always on the libertarian side, whereas now the left, which at least was typically for personal freedoms, was freedom-oriented, and they were economically not very free. Now their personal freedoms, no, they're authoritarian about it. Who you should hang out with, what you have to wear, what medications you have to take, as well as being authoritarian on economic issues. So they are in the down position, depending on how you orient this plot. So, and you've got, we had Naomi Wolf over in the libertarian position next to all of these conservatives. So something qualitatively just transition certainly seemed to happen in early mid 2020.
And it's not politics. I mean, part of it was obviously you said you think it's now about 50% who have essentially either always thought that that there was hysteria, or they've now recognized that what we went through was hysteria. So you think 50% won't buy it if they try to bring back this stuff? Do you think it's about 50-50?
I think it is. And I think just as a general rule, societies often just sort of end up clumping into that. And if there's really, I suspect plus or minus 5% that there's almost a half of the population which won't stand for this and have much stronger opinions than they had before. Whether it's 50% that's strong enough to actually cause havoc, but it's not the 2% before. And I think the other side is also feeling weak. I remember I was at a Delta lounge in the airport, and me and actually two Iranian women, and then me and it was just three of us, two Iranian women and me, sitting there just having a drink, and we of course took our masks off at the lounge, and the lady stood up and said, "You guys, you keep having your masks off for too long while you're drinking. You should put it back on between drinks." I was like, "I'm not going to put it back on between." And she's like, "Do you know who I am and all the studies that I've read?" And I was like, "Okay, really?" And then another person stood up. And another person stood up, and they all started to attack us, and they wouldn't leave us alone. And I'm like, "Are you you're standing around two women who escaped Iran because of snitches like you on the street that would attack them and hit them and pull their hair on the street or arrest them and kill them once the government gets involved, right? For not wearing a headscarf. And you dare to approach these women and attack them. It boggles my mind. I don't think that, they had the confidence to do this because they felt, rightly, that they had the backing or the silence of anybody else that was not sure, because they were kept quiet. I don't think they have the feeling that we're going to sit still if they do that again.
And what's the quality? You mentioned Naomi Wolf, and I don't want to be like patting ourselves on the back, like, oh, all the people that that didn't buy into this from the beginning, but there were certain people. And it wasn't left and it wasn't right. I don't know what the quality is of these people, because I collected them from all over the internet because I was following all these different people. Some were doctors, some were, some were involved in politics, but most politicians went behind this completely. I mean, in the US, I can't think of any hero outside of Rand Paul and Thomas Massey there, these guys in Kentucky. But most of these politicians were totally cowardly. And I'm talking about Trump, DeSantis. DeSantis went along with this stuff.
Exactly, Kemp, he did, yeah.
Kemp was pretty good in Georgia, but almost every politician knuckled under to this thing. Yeah. What was the quality of people like someone on the left like Naomi Wolf or someone like yourself? What is the quality of why didn't people buy into this hysteria? Right. Is it just, could you call them just skeptical?
Well, I've written about this a lot, and here's a few things. It's not about political where your politics are. It's not about how smart you are. As we know, if anything, it's possibly an inverse correlation. These are really bright people that were agitating for authoritarianism. For some of the brightest people you've ever heard of were agitating for authoritarianism. It's not most educated. Education doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. As far as, I mean, again, these aren't studies. This is just your vague impression from what you're seeing. I think at the end of the day, it really is where you sat within the network. All of us have the beliefs that we do. 99.9% of them are because of the network that we sit in, by which there's a bunch of high reputation people around me, lots of people on networks that I trust more or less, depending on how I feel like the reputation of telling me right or wrong things is over time. And most of what I believe is because I've heard them from people that I trust, right? I don't have to, I'm a scientist, so I've got maybe several dozen things that I actually know because I did the data and I did the t-test and this, but still that's maybe, 25 things out of the millions of things that I know, right? Or I believe that I know. And the average person is just all based on the network. So if I was sitting in academia and was a normal academic that hadn't, always been libertarian and sort of felt aloof from those sorts of forces, I suspect I would have come to believe all of the same things that they believed and believed that masks didn't work and then suddenly believed they work again 2 months later, right? Because suddenly I'd hear from all of these seemingly independent sources these really good arguments that they believed them. They really did believe these good arguments. So I trust them and I would come to believe it. I would have been a great authoritarian proponent if I sat in the wrong part of the network. Now, for my own case, I've always been, as a scientist, aiming to be aloof. And there was all these sorts of principles for being a good scientist, especially being a good theorist. And I would teach my students and have sort of little talks that I would give them on these sort of multifaceted ways of maintaining your independence so that you don't get gobbled up by scientific communities where certain conference communities where you go there and you're young and you want to be like Doug or Susie who's 40 and they've already have all these great discoveries. And then once you do become 40, you have a little bit of gray and the young men are giving you all of this, respect and you like it. And the girls are batting their eyes and you like it. And you're like the big guy with all these great discoveries. And so you end up spending your whole life thinking that these ideas are so big because of where you sit within these communities. So I always said, I can't do that. I'm a theorist. I've got to move on to new ideas in some new field where I have a chance to come up with some grand unifying theory because that's the kind of stuff that I do. So I always had to remain aloof from those kinds of psychosocial pressures. So I was always aware of it for science, creativity kinds of reasons. And ultimately I left academia because it was so oppressive, these kinds of things, to have my own research institute, my own company that supports my independent research. So I was very heightened personally about remaining aloof, right? So I think that protected me, and it was just peculiar that I happened to have that as one of my lifestyle choices, so to speak, was to keep that aloofness. Each person might have had their own peculiarities that made them more aloof due to the way they chose to live their life. It'd be great to have a kind of study of this kind.
Yeah, and it's so true in academia. I think the pressure to conform with your peers in academia, peer review, the whole way that academia is set up, even before they were canceling people, even before you were getting fired for ideas, I think that everybody in academia was afraid. They've always been afraid of going against the grain of their peers. And now, obviously, it's worse than ever because they are actually, they're firing people and taking their bank accounts away and things like that.
Right.
And
that's what it is. If you don't get a grant, and it's very hard to get a grant. You might have to apply for 10 grants to get a grant. And if word gets out that you don't believe in masks or you were an anti-lockdowner, you are potentially out of luck for the rest of your life. We're quickly spread.
Yeah, then all you can do is podcast. That's your only option. So, Mark, tell me before we leave, tell me about two things. Your book, Expressly Human?
That's right, yeah.
So do the book first.
Yeah, so Expressly Human is a book that came out. Dr. Tim Barber and myself, we've been colleagues and good friends for years. It's about the origins of emotional expressions. Why Darwin asked, one of the other books that Darwin is well known for was why animals have emotional expressions at all. He sort of began asking the question and studying it. And so our claim is that our book really answers why we have emotional expressions at all, how they work as the first language of all social animals in terms of sort of human-human, in our case, human-human socio-emotional negotiation. And it involves a kind of poker game that we're always playing where we're betting reputation chips, betting social capital and losing or gaining it depending on how things turned out. that is the true language that we speak. And even right now, I'm speaking it because I have all this intonation in my voice. I have all these gestures and these facial expressions and the choice of words. That's ultimately why, if you believe anything that I said, it's not because of the propositions in logic, and I'm also a logician, but it's not really about that. It's because of the confidence that I evinced to you, right? To the audience members. And they're like, yeah, Mark really seems like he knows what he's talking about. I'm going to believe him because I don't have time to go, actually do whatever, read the studies that he claims to read. I got too much other crap in my life to do. That's how we all learn things. So, and it's also about the origins of free expression itself, because free expression leads towards the truth in the long run. It's an ugly process, but it works because of these kinds of individual socio-emotional little games that we play. And then I was douchebaggy and I lost reputation to you, or I wasn't douchebaggy, in which case, even if I'm wrong, I may not lose any. These times trillions of these pairwise interactions of all of these free expression arguments, that's, just sort of the public square writ large, how free expression works, right? So ironically, in 2002, when it came out in the summer, I was suspended from Twitter. And then when they let me back in, Twitter, I was under a sensitive content label for a year and a half. So I had almost no views. Anybody who saw my tweets, it just says, this is sensitive content. You have to go change your settings. And most of them didn't want to change their settings because it required that their birth date be visible and things like this. And then they start to see porn from anybody else publishing things if they change that setting. Yeah. So I was censored in that sense by the federal government. My book was censored by the federal government in the sense that if you can't talk about your book, if you can't go out there and plug it, because you're just, the public square has censored you, then it was censored. So I'd love people to go get a copy. It's my 6th book. It's, I think, one of my greatest discoveries. And it's unfortunate. It took 12 years to make and only a few moments for the federal government to make sure no one reads.
And then the website that you started, what is it? I don't know.
FreeX. FreeX.group, the free expression group.
So this is a good opportunity. People can go and visit FreeX, the website. What is it? FreeX.com or something like that?
.group. It's FreeX.group, the FreeX group. And there's sort of a newsletter associated called Aloofwire, like be aloof, the idea is be aloof. That's one of the best things you can do to avoid moral contagion, social contagion and moral panics. And it's just called Loof, L-O-O-F, Loofwire.com. I'm trying to basically create a science magazine that's political and scientific, that's taking on Siam and Wired, that are all politically lobotomized and even scientifically often lobotomized. So Loofwire.com, I focus on issues like this, and there's so many deep, interesting scientific issues that are connected to the politics of the day that Loofwire.com looks at.
Great. Okay. Look, we'll leave it there, but hopefully we'll do it again. I know I'm going to see another video of yours and be like, oh, we got to talk to Mark about this again, because, it's not just COVID. There's lots of stuff about freedom, human perception. I mean, you're kind of like you're an interesting guy. So, this isn't just, I want people to follow you, but not only in a COVID sense, there's other reasons, I mean, you probably think of that yourself that way. Do you consider yourself kind of a COVID celebrity? Because I feel like you're obviously, your popularity took off during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it did and it didn't. So I was, I have a kind of pre-COVID life where I've got several TED Talks and I've been, in brain games on the head, get sort of the regular science, done a lot of TV things. So I had a fair degree of success as a scientist in terms of discoveries that were well known, and some facet of the public had learned about me because I was writing for Wired and writing for Discover Magazine, things like this. But and then COVID hit, and now none of those science journalist things are interested in me anymore, because now I'm evil, unclean denier or whatever, right? Yeah. But now I have this whole new audience and I've become sort of a freedom fighter stage of my life, where I'm looking sort of at the science and the philosophy underlying sort of freedom and free expression and collective hysteria and things like that. So this sort of I don't know which part of it matters more to me, but I never thought I would end up to be involved in a freedom movement, but life does funny things, yeah.
Well, that's great. And I'm glad that I was one of the first guys to to kind of glom onto you, because, I'll kind of take that as a badge of honor, because I wasn't a fighter. I wasn't a warrior during COVID, if only because I couldn't deal. I could not get on every day and talk about these things because it was lunacy to me. It was like, you must have found yourself being annoyed. I have to say this again and again to you people.
Right. Well, in fact, I mean, I had a Science Moment series, my YouTube series. I was on like video 50 when COVID hit, and it was just about research, just science stuff, right? Like little short videos. And then when COVID hit, I can't just keep doing those videos, which were just like, it's like a sign, like an artist. World War II hits, the Nazis are invading, Europe, and the person is still doing the same, paintings they always were. It's like, so it took me 4 or 5 months for me to realize, like, actually, no, there's so much interesting science. It was both the most scary thing to see. Totalitarianism is super scary, but it's also super interesting. The emergent phenomena, complex systems that are involved in these massive evolved psychologies spread across society. There's so many deep, interesting things that are going on. So now, that was on episode 51 that I restarted it a few months later. Now I'm on episode 412. So I've had, I'm approaching 400 videos of my Science Moment series at YouTube and at Rumble that are in and around the kinds of events that have occurred since COVID, but from an angle no one else is usually talking about.
Excellent. Well, Mark, thanks so much for spending time. This is kind of I haven't been podcasting. For whatever reason, I won't apologize for not doing that. But now that I'm back into it, I feel like this is going to be an inaugural episode, and hopefully I'll be able to keep up some good podcasting habits. But I was glad to have you as the first guy back.
Great to be here.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. There it is, Mark Changizi. And I think that was a pretty good time. It's a little bit longer than I liked. I want to do half-hour podcasts because those are the ones that generally 30 minutes. That's kind of my thing. And so, we'll go over occasionally, but I think that was very nice and very tidy for our first podcast return. Thanks for listening. We will see you soon.